She traveled 1,000 miles to marry a man she had never met, only to find his wife standing in the doorway. He never wanted her. He wanted the deed to 60 acres of Montana land her father won in the only card game he ever played. Now she's standing at the edge of a Wyoming town with a knife in one hand, 2 bags holding everything she owns, and a con man telling the whole territory she's a thief. He's already destroyed other women this way. One of them hanged herself in her barn on Christmas Eve, and there's a hired tracker closing in, carrying forged papers and orders to bring her back. Dead or alive doesn't matter. The only person who stops to help is a cowboy with scarred knuckles and green eyes full of something broken. A man who beat someone nearly to death with his bare hands and is riding north toward the ghost of the man who burned his wife alive. She doesn't know if he's her salvation or just another kind of danger, and he doesn't know if saving her will redeem him or finally destroy what's left of his soul. This story reminds us that the bravest thing you can ever do is stay, when every instinct tells you to run, and that real love doesn't rescue you. It stands beside you while you learn to rescue yourself. Welcome to Wild West Stories, where the wild frontier strips everything down to what truly matters: the courage to love again, the fierce bonds between family, and the simple human kindness that holds people together when the whole world is trying to tear them apart. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.
Catherine Owen had been lied to 3 times in her life. First by her father, when he promised he would never leave her. Second by Aunt Martha, when she swore that marriage would fix everything. And third by Robert Calloway, who wrote her beautiful letters about building a library on the frontier and forgot to mention he had already married someone else. So when the 4th man that day stumbled toward her at the edge of Jackson, Wyoming, reeking of whiskey and wearing a grin that made her skin crawl, Catherine pulled the small knife from her carpet bag and held it where he could see it. The drunk stopped. He squinted at the blade, then at her face, and whatever he saw there convinced him to find easier company. He turned and staggered back toward the row of saloons that lined the main street of Jackson like rotten teeth. Catherine let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her hand was steady on the knife. That surprised her. 3 days ago, when she first stepped off the stage and walked up to Robert Calloway's front door, her hands had been shaking so bad she could barely knock. She remembered that knock now. 3 sharp raps against painted wood, the door opening. A woman standing there, pretty and confused, wearing a wedding ring that caught the afternoon light. Margaret, that was her name. Margaret Avery, now Margaret Calloway. And she had looked at Catherine with the kind of pity that made Catherine want to disappear into the floorboards. Robert had appeared behind his new wife like a shadow in a good suit. Not a trace of shame on his face. Not a flicker of guilt in those brown eyes that had been described in his letters as warm and honest. He told Catherine she had arrived late, that he could not wait forever, that a man had to be practical about these things. And then his gaze had dropped to her carpet bag, and his voice had gone smooth as oil on water. "You still have that Montana deed," he said. "Perhaps I could help you sell it. I would only take a small commission for the trouble." Catherine had understood then, standing in the doorway of a stranger's house 1,000 miles from everything she knew. The deed was what he wanted all along. Not her. Never her. The land her father had won in the only card game he ever played, 60 acres in Montana territory, that existed on a piece of paper she carried in her leather satchel. That was the real bride Robert Calloway had been courting. She left without another word. She did not cry until she reached the boarding house, and even then she kept it quiet, pressing her face into the flat pillow so the walls would not carry the sound. That was 3 days ago. 3 days of sitting in a room she could no longer pay for, eating meals she could not afford, trying to find a way north with no money and no connections, and no one in the world who cared whether Catherine Owen lived or died. Now she stood at the edge of town with everything she owned in 2 bags, A carpet bag holding 3 dresses, a hairbrush, her father's book of poetry, and the knife. A leather satchel containing her mother's wedding ring and the deed to land she had never seen. The autumn wind of 1878 whipped her dark hair across her face, and the Teton Range rose up behind the town like a wall between her and everything she wanted. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw the rider, a steady rhythm on packed earth coming from the south. She turned, one hand still on the knife, and watched him approach. He sat tall in the saddle, the kind of tall that came from years of living on horseback rather than any desire to impress. Broad shoulders under a dusty brown hat, leather vest over a blue cotton shirt that had been washed enough times to go soft at the collar. His bay mare moved with the easy gait of a horse that had covered a lot of ground and expected to cover more. He reined in near the edge of town, not because of Catherine, but because there was a water trough there, and the horse needed a drink. He glanced at her, quick, assessing, the way a man looks at the landscape to check for trouble. He saw the knife in her hand, the carpet bag at her feet, the thin cotton dress that was meant for Boston sidewalks and not mountain wind. Something crossed his face. Pain, maybe, or recognition. It was there and gone so fast Catherine could not be sure she had seen it at all. "Where are you headed, miss?" he said. Not really a question. More like the kind of thing a man says when he is making conversation with a fence post and expects about the same level of response. "North," Catherine said. She lifted her chin. "Montana Territory. I have land near Virginia City." The cowboy let his horse drink. He looked north toward the mountains, then back at her. "Long way from here," he said. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more habit than courtesy, and turned his horse toward the water trough on the far side of the street. He was going to ride on. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he had already dismissed her from his attention. "Wait," Catherine said. The word came out sharper than she intended. "Do you know the route north? Is there a stage, a wagon train, anything?" He stopped, did not turn around right away. She watched his back, the way his hands tightened on the reins, and she knew he was fighting with himself about something. When he finally looked at her again, his eyes were green. Summer grass green, her mother would have said. And there was something in them that looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether to step back or jump. "I am headed to Bozeman," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel under boots. "If you can keep up, you can ride along. I do not wait for anyone." He did not wait for her answer. He rode toward the livery at the end of the street, and Catherine watched his back grow smaller and asked herself which was worse: following a stranger into the wilderness, or spending one more night in Jackson while Robert Calloway knew exactly where she was. She picked up her carpet bag. She picked up her satchel. And she followed. Yates Young was angry with himself, which was nothing new, because Yates Young had been angry with himself for the better part of 3 years. But this particular anger had a fresh edge to it, sharp enough to cut, and he could feel it sawing at his ribs as he unsaddled his mare in the livery and tried to figure out what in the name of all that was holy had possessed him to invite a strange woman along on a 300-mile ride through mountain country in October. He knew what it was. He did not want to name it, but he knew. It was the way she held that knife, not like a woman who had been taught to defend herself, like a woman who had decided all on her own that she was not going to be a victim. And something about that decision, visible in the white knuckles of her grip and the steel in her dark eyes, had reached into the locked room in his chest where he kept the things he could not look at and rattled the door. He told himself it was because of Samuel, the old Shoshone trader at Fort Bridger who had taken in 2 orphaned children 20 years ago, fed them through a winter, paid for their passage west in the spring. Samuel, who said kindness does not need a reason. Yates had been paying that debt forward his whole life, one small act at a time, and this was just another installment. That was all. That was the only reason. He lay down in the hay of the livery stall and closed his eyes and tried to sleep. But sleep had not been a friend of his in a long time. When it finally came, it brought the dream. The same dream. Always the same. Fire. A house made of logs and love. And 3 years of hard work, burning against a night sky. A woman's voice calling his name. Eliza. Eliza screaming from inside walls that were already falling. And then the scene changed the way dreams do, without reason. And he was in a saloon in Denver with his hands around a man's throat, and the man's face was turning purple. And the terrible thing was not what Yates was doing, but how good it felt, how right, how hungry he was for the sound of bones giving way under his fingers. He woke, gasping, sweat on his face, hay in his hair. The bay mare watching him from across the stall with calm brown eyes that held no judgment. Just a dream, he told her. Same one as always. He did not go back to sleep. Before dawn, he walked into town to buy supplies. He did not want to. Every dollar he spent on that woman was $1 less for his own purpose. And his purpose was the only thing that had kept him moving forward since Colorado. But he was not going to watch her try to cross the Snake River in a cotton dress and city shoes. That was not kindness. That was common sense. At least that was what he told himself. The general store was not yet open, but the owner, a thin man named Pruitt with suspicious eyes and a talent for gossip, was sweeping the porch. Pruitt unlocked the door when he saw money in Yates's hand, and Yates moved through the store picking out what he needed. Canvas pants, small size, wool coat, riding boots that looked about right, a wide-brimmed hat, bedding, dried beef, hard biscuits, coffee. Pruitt watched him stack the goods on the counter and added up numbers on a scrap of paper. Then he looked up with the kind of smile that meant he had information to sell. "That girl at the boarding house," Pruitt said, "the one from Boston. You are not the only one interested." Yates said nothing. He counted out coins. "Robert Calloway has been asking after her," Pruitt continued, undeterred by the silence. "Asking about some deed she's carrying. He married the Avery woman for her cash dowry, $200, but I hear the land deed is what he really wanted. 60 acres up in Montana, good land near water, worth a sight more than $200. Yates looked at the shopkeeper. Pruitt swallowed and found somewhere else to put his eyes. "She know about this?" Yates asked. "The whole town knows. Calloway is not exactly quiet about his business. He's been telling folks the girl stole that deed from him, offering money to anyone who brings her back." Yates gathered his purchases and walked out without another word. But his jaw was tight, and his hands were not steady, and the anger that lived in his chest had shifted from himself to a man he had never met. Robert Calloway. A man who hunted women the way some men hunted game, for sport and profit. The kind of man who burned things down and walked away clean. The kind of man Yates had sworn he would never let win again. He found Catherine at the livery before sunrise, already awake, already dressed in her thin city clothes, her carpetbag packed and her chin lifted like she was daring the world to knock her down one more time. He handed her the bundle of supplies without explanation. "Put these on," he said. "We leave in 20 minutes. She opened the bundle, looked at the riding clothes, the boots, the coat. Something moved across her face that might have been gratitude, and might have been the effort of swallowing pride. "I cannot pay you for these," she said. "Did not ask you to. You can pay me back when you get settled on your land. Now get dressed. We are burning daylight." He saddled Daisy, the gentle gray mare that had belonged to his sister before she married and moved to California. Daisy was sweet-tempered and sure-footed, the kind of horse that took care of her rider instead of the other way around. Catherine would need that, because it was clear from the way she approached the horse, stiff and uncertain and holding the reins like they might bite her, that she had spent very little time in a saddle. It took her 3 tries to mount. Yates watched without comment, which cost him more patience than he usually had available. When she was finally up, sitting rigid and gripping the saddle horn with both hands, he swung onto his bay and pointed them north. They rode for hours without speaking. The morning air was cold enough to turn breath to fog, and the valley floor gave way to rolling hills dotted with sage and cottonwood. Catherine bounced in the saddle like a sack of flour, and Yates could see every jarring step register on her face, but she did not complain. He found himself grudgingly impressed by that. At camp that evening, after he had built the fire and put coffee on and shown her how to hobble Daisy so the mare could graze without wandering, Catherine sat on her bedroll and looked at him across the flames. "Why did you come back?" she asked. "You were going to ride on. I saw it. You had already decided to leave me there. What changed your mind?" Yates poured coffee into the single tin cup and handed it to her. He drank his own from the pot, which was hot enough to burn his lip, and the small pain gave him something to focus on besides the question. "Someone helped me once," he said. "A long time ago, when I needed it and did not deserve it. He told me if I wanted to pay him back, I should do the same for someone else. So that is what I'm doing, paying a debt. That is all." Catherine studied him over the rim of the cup. Her dark eyes were sharp and searching, and Yates had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see straight through his words to the hollow space behind them. "That is all," she repeated. "That is all." She nodded slowly, took a drink of coffee, did not press further. And Yates told himself the conversation was over, and the matter settled, and if his hands were still not steady when he lay down to sleep, it was only because of the cold. He did not sleep. Sometime past midnight, he heard it. Hoofbeats behind them on the trail, faint and steady, following the same path they had taken. He sat up and listened until the sound faded into wind. Could have been anything. A wild horse, a traveler, nothing to worry about. He rested his hand on the colt at his hip and watched the darkness until dawn, and he did not close his eyes. Catherine's body was declaring war on her by the third day. Her thighs burned from gripping the saddle. Her lower back felt like someone had taken a hammer to it. Her hands were blistered raw from the reins despite the leather gloves Yates had grudgingly offered her on the second morning. She did not complain about any of it, partly because she could see that Yates valued endurance the way some men valued money, and partly because complaining would not make it hurt less. What she did instead was watch him. Not the way a woman watches a man she is attracted to, though she was not blind, and she could see plain enough that Yates Young was built like someone God had designed for hard country. She watched him the way her father had taught her to watch the world, with curiosity and attention to detail, looking for the story underneath the surface. And Yates Young was full of contradictions. His hands were rough and calloused, scarred across the knuckles in a way that spoke of violence. But when he touched his horse or adjusted Daisy's bridle, those same hands were gentle as a mother with a newborn. His eyes went soft when he looked at the mountains in the early light, but they turned to stone when he checked their back trail, which he did every few minutes now with a regularity that made Catherine's stomach tight. He had packed cooking supplies for 2 people, but owned only 1 tin cup, which he gave to her without being asked, and drank his coffee from the pot like it was the most natural thing in the world. And there was the harmonica. She had seen it in his saddlebag that first morning, a small silver instrument worn smooth with use. He never played it, never even took it out. But he kept it close, the way a person keeps something they cannot let go of and cannot bear to use. On the third day, while Yates rode ahead to scout the trail through a narrow canyon, Catherine reached into his saddlebag. She was looking for the medical kit. Her blisters had opened and were bleeding through the gloves, and she knew from her father's books that open wounds in dirty conditions could turn bad fast. Her fingers searched past the harmonica, past a coil of leather cord, past a pouch of tobacco he never smoked, and closed around something small and hard and cold. She pulled it out, a woman's wedding ring. Simple gold band, thin, sized for a slender finger. It was tucked into a soft leather pouch alongside a folded piece of paper that Catherine did not read because some boundaries, even desperation, would not cross. She sat in Daisy's saddle, holding the ring in her palm, and felt the ground shift under her. He is married, or he was, or he is lying to me. Just like Robert. Just like every man I have ever been fool enough to trust. She put the ring back. She found the medical kit and cleaned her blisters and wrapped them in strips of cloth and said nothing when Yates returned from scouting. But something had changed in her, and she could feel the warmth she'd been building toward this quiet cowboy freeze over like a pond in November. She gave shorter answers, kept more distance between their horses. When they dismounted at midday to rest and Yates offered his hand to help her down, she swung off on her own and nearly fell and caught herself, and did not look at him. Yates noticed. She could tell by the way his brow furrowed and his mouth tightened, the way he kept glancing at her like he was trying to solve a problem he could not see. But he did not ask, and she did not tell. On the fourth day, they came upon a small wagon train. 5 wagons, 3 families, moving west toward Oregon. They had stopped beside a creek to water the oxen, and the sound of children's voices carried across the meadow like birdsong. Catherine saw a young woman sitting on the tailgate of the last wagon, holding a baby that was flushed and fretful, and something in the way the mother held the child, desperate and exhausted, pulled Catherine off her horse before she consciously decided to help. The baby had a fever. Catherine knew fevers. Her father had kept a shelf of medical texts alongside his literature, and he had taught her the practical things, the herbs and poultices that could bring a temperature down when a doctor was 50 miles away. She found willow bark in the brush near the creek, stripped it, and showed the mother how to brew a tea and cool it and feed it to the baby with a cloth. While she worked, she felt eyes on her. She looked up and saw Yates watching from a distance, still mounted, and the expression on his face stopped her cold. It was not admiration. It was not even concern. It was grief, raw and exposed and terrible, like a man looking at something beautiful that reminded him of everything he had lost. She thought about the ring in his saddlebag. She thought about a wife somewhere, maybe with a baby of her own, and she felt sick with something that was not quite jealousy and not quite anger, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. That evening, camped in a grove of aspens turning gold with autumn, Catherine told Yates about her father. She did not plan to. The words just came. The way they do when you have been carrying something alone for too long, and the weight finally becomes more than you can bear in silence. My father was a school teacher, she said, in Boston. He taught Latin and Greek and mathematics, and he believed with his whole heart that education was the door to freedom, for anyone, man or woman. My aunt thought he was filling my head with useless knowledge. She said no man wanted a wife who could conjugate Latin verbs. My father said any man who was threatened by a woman's learning was not worth marrying. She paused, stared into the fire. He died 2 years ago. Left nothing but debts and that deed to Montana land. He won it in a card game, the only card game he ever played in his life. Can you imagine that? A man who never gambled, sitting down one night in a tavern and walking out with 60 acres. He was going to take us there, start over. But then he got sick, and my aunt took me in, and she made it clear that I was a burden she could not carry forever. Catherine looked up. Yates was watching her with his green eyes, his face half in shadow and half in firelight, and for a moment she forgot about the ring and the wife and all the reasons she had built a wall between them. "What about you?" she said. "You told me about your mother, about Samuel at Fort Bridger, but there is a gap in your story, Yates. You went from 17 to drifting, and you left out everything in between." He was quiet for a long time. The fire popped and sent sparks up into the cold dark. "My sister married," he said, "went to California with her husband. I worked cattle drives, ranch work, moved around. And that is all. That is all. It was not all." She could see the lie sitting in the space between his words, as visible as a stone in a clear stream. She thought about pressing. She thought about the ring. She thought about Robert Calloway and his beautiful letters full of beautiful lies. And she made a decision. "You do not have to tell me everything," she said quietly. "But do not lie to me. I have had enough lies to last a lifetime." Yates met her eyes. "I have not lied to you," he said. And she supposed that was technically true. But omission was its own kind of dishonesty, and they both knew it. That night, she lay in her bedroll listening to the wind in the aspens and thinking about the contradictions of the man sleeping 10 feet away. the gentle hands and the stone eyes, the single tin cup and the absent wife, the harmonica he carried, but would not play. She was still thinking when she heard his breathing change, going ragged and fast, the sounds of a dream that was not a good one. She heard him say a word that might have been a name, but the wind carried it away before she could be sure. In the morning, while Catherine was saddling Daisy, a man from the wagon train they had passed the day before rode up alongside them. He was friendly and weathered and spoke with the easy confidence of someone who had been on the trail long enough to feel like he owned it. "You folks be careful heading north," he said. "Heard there is a merchant in Jackson put out word he is looking for a woman who stole property from him, offering good money to anyone who brings her back." Catherine's hands went still on the saddle cinch. She managed to smile and thanked the man for the warning, and when he rode away she stood very still for a long time, staring at nothing, feeling the ground that she had thought was solid beginning to crack and shift beneath her feet. Robert was not just sitting in Jackson feeling sorry for himself. He was turning her into a criminal. He was telling the world that she was a thief, and in a territory where justice was rough and reputations were everything, that kind of talk could get a woman locked up or worse. She did not tell Yates about the conversation. She had her reasons. She did not want to give him another cause to pity her, and she did not want to owe him anything more than she already did. But she noticed that morning that Yates was acting different too. He had found something near their camp, though he did not say what. He kept looking over his shoulder with a frequency that made her neck tense, and when he spoke his voice had a new urgency in it. "We ride faster today," he said. Catherine asked why. He did not answer, but she watched him check his revolver before mounting his horse, spinning the cylinder and counting the rounds with the ease of long practice. And she thought about the ring hidden in his saddlebag and wondered how many secrets a man could carry before the weight of them broke something that could not be mended. Yates heard the river before he saw it. A low roar that vibrated through the ground and set his mare's ears forward with attention. The Snake River in October was a different animal than the Snake River in July. Autumn rains had swollen it past its banks, turning what was normally a manageable ford into a quarter-mile of brown water moving fast enough to carry a horse off its feet. He reined in on the bluff above the crossing and studied the water. The safest ford was half a day's ride upstream, where the river widened and slowed over a gravel bed. That was the smart choice, the careful choice. But careful meant half a day of riding in the wrong direction, and behind them, somewhere on the trail they had traveled, there was a rider. Yates had found the hoof prints that morning, fresh as yesterday's bread, no more than 2 hours behind. Single rider, heavy horse, moving with the steady purpose of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Half a day upstream meant letting that rider close the distance. It meant spending another night on the trail with whatever was following them. And Yates had spent enough nights listening to darkness to know that waiting was its own kind of danger. He looked at the river. He looked at Catherine, sitting straight in Daisy's saddle with her jaw set the way it always was when she was hurting and refusing to show it. 6 days of riding had changed her. She held the reins with confidence now instead of fear. Her body moved with the horse instead of fighting it. She still could not mount without a struggle, and her dismounts were graceless, but she was tougher than she looked and getting tougher every day. "We cross here," he said. Catherine looked at the water. She did not argue, though he could see her throat work as she swallowed. She could not swim. She had told him that on the second day, matter of fact, no shame in it. She was from Boston. There had been no reason to learn. "Stay close to me," Yates said. "Let Daisy find her footing. Do not fight the current. If you go in, grab the saddle horn and do not let go. Do you understand?" "I understand," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. They started across. The water was cold, shockingly cold, the kind of cold that stole your breath and replaced it with something that felt like panic. It rose past Yates's boots, past his stirrups, past the belly of his mare. The current pushed against them like a living thing, and his horse braced and fought and found her way across the slippery rocks with the determination of an animal that had done this before and did not intend to stop doing it. He was 2/3 of the way across when he heard it. a splash, and a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a gasp. He turned in the saddle and saw Daisy scrambling on the rocks, her hindquarters swinging downstream, and Catherine going into the water. The current took her immediately. One moment she was there, clinging to the saddle horn the way he had told her, and the next moment the river ripped her loose, and she was tumbling downstream, her dark hair fanning out on the brown water, her arms flailing against a force that did not care about her strength or her courage or the deed to 60 acres in Montana territory. Yates was off his horse and in the water before he made the decision to move. His body knew what to do even when his mind was still processing the sight of her going under. He let the current carry him, angling across the flow, his eyes locked on the place where her head kept appearing and disappearing. The cold hit him like a fist. His ribs, still tender from an old injury that had never quite healed right, screamed as the water slammed him against something hard beneath the surface. He caught her 30 yards downstream. His hand closed on her coat collar, and he hauled her toward the bank with everything he had, kicking against the current, his boots finding purchase on the river bottom, and losing it and finding it again. Catherine was coughing and choking and gripping his arm with a strength that surprised him. They made the bank, barely. Yates dragged them both up onto the rocks and collapsed on his back, breathing hard, his left side feeling like someone had taken a hammer to it. The world went gray around the edges, and he fought to keep it in focus. Catherine was on her hands and knees beside him, coughing up river water soaked through, shaking with cold. She looked at him and saw something in his face that brought her from her knees to his side in an instant. "You are hurt," she said. It was not a question. Yates tried to sit up. The pain in his left side turned from a dull ache into something bright and sharp that locked his breath in his chest. He fell back. "Ribs," he managed. "Hit a rock." Catherine's hands were on him before he could protest. She opened his vest, pulled his wet shirt up, and he heard the sharp intake of her breath when she saw the bruising. Ugly purple and black spreading across his left side, from his hip to his armpit, the kind of bruise that meant something underneath was broken. "Do not move," she said. "Just do not move." And then she was gone, and he lay there on the rocks listening to the river roar past, staring at the sky, which was gray and indifferent and offered no opinion on whether Yates Young would live or die. He heard sounds, the snap of dry branches, the scrape of a fire steel, a small flame catching, growing, reaching toward the cold air with orange fingers. Catherine came back with the medical kit and a spare shirt torn into strips, and she bound his ribs with hands that were steady even though the rest of her was shaking. "I need to check if anything is broken," she said. "This is going to hurt." She pressed her fingers along his rib cage, gentle but firm, and Yates clenched his teeth and focused on a spot in the sky where a hawk was circling. 2 ribs, maybe 3. She could feel them shifting under her touch, and each shift sent a bolt of lightning through his body that turned the world white. "Cracked at least," she said. "Maybe broken. You should not ride today." "We do not have a choice," Yates said. But even as he said it, he tried to sit up and the pain drove him back down like a hand on his chest. The world went gray again, and this time it stayed gray for a while. When he came back to himself, there was a fire burning, and his wet clothes were hung on branches nearby, and he was wrapped in a blanket that smelled like horse and wood smoke. Catherine was tending the horses. He could hear her voice, low and steady, talking to Daisy the way he talked to his own mare, the voice you use to calm a frightened animal. She had built the fire. She had made camp. She had unsaddled both horses and set them to graze and dressed his wounds and hung his clothes to dry. She had done all of it alone, and done it right. And Yates lay there in the firelight and understood that he had underestimated her badly. They lost a day. Yates could not ride, could barely sit up without the room spinning, and Catherine would not let him try. She cooked meals from their supplies, kept the fire going against the cold, and kept watch on the trail behind them with a vigilance that told him she knew about the rider, even though he had never told her. That night, fever found him. The cold water and the exertion and the cracked ribs conspired together, and his body temperature climbed while his mind slid sideways into places he did not want to go. He drifted in and out of sleep, and in the spaces between waking and dreaming, the walls he had built so carefully over 3 years began to crumble. Catherine was sitting beside him, feeding the fire with small sticks, when she heard him speak. His voice was thin, stretched, the voice of a man walking through rooms he had locked shut years ago. "Eliza," he said. Then, like a prayer turned inside out, "I am sorry. I should have been there. I am sorry." Catherine's hands went still. The stick she was holding hovered above the flames, motionless. She looked at his face. His eyes were closed, his expression tight with pain that had nothing to do with broken ribs. His lips moved again, forming the name like it was something sacred and terrible at the same time. Not a wife waiting somewhere, not a secret family, a wife he had lost. The ring in his saddlebag was not evidence of deception. It was evidence of grief, and suddenly every contradiction in Yates Young made sense. The gentle hands and the hard eyes, the single tin cup, the harmonica he carried but could not play, the nightmares, the walls, the way he watched her hold that baby at the wagon train, like a man watching a memory he could not bear to touch. Catherine put down the stick. She lay down beside Yates, close enough that her body heat crossed the small distance between them, close enough that she could feel his chest rise and fall with each labored breath. She pressed her back against his side carefully, avoiding his injured ribs, and pulled the blanket over both of them. He was shivering. She held him through it. Nothing happened. Nothing needed to happen. The intimacy of lying beside a man in the dark, feeling his heart beat through the wool and cotton between them, hearing his breath slowly settle from the ragged pace of fever to something calmer, something that sounded almost like peace. That was enough. That was already more than she had expected to feel again. She stayed awake all night. She watched the fire and the stars and the line of mountains black against the sky, and she thought about a woman named Eliza who had been loved and lost, and about a man who had been carrying that loss like a stone in his chest for 3 years, and about the difference between a lie and a silence, and about which one was harder to forgive. When Yates opened his eyes at dawn, Catherine was sitting beside him with dark circles under her eyes, and a look on her face that he could not read. She had kept watch all night. She had kept him warm through the fever. She had not slept. He wanted to say thank you. He wanted to say more than thank you. Instead, the fear that lived in the place behind his ribs asked the question for him. Did I say anything while I was sleeping? Catherine looked him straight in the eyes, and there was no pity there and no judgment, only the steady, searching honesty that had drawn him to her from the moment he saw her holding a knife at the edge of town. "Who is Eliza?" she said. Yates had not spoken that name aloud in 3 years. Hearing it from Catherine's mouth was like a knife finding a wound he thought had scarred over. He sat up too fast. His ribs punished him for it, and he doubled over with his arms wrapped around his middle, breathing through his teeth until the pain backed off enough to let him think. Catherine waited. She did not rush him. She did not look away. She sat with her hands in her lap and her dark hair loose around her shoulders, still wearing yesterday's clothes because she had spent the night keeping him alive instead of sleeping, and she waited for him to find the words. They did not come easy. They had to ride. He knew that. Whoever was behind them had gained ground while they sat still, and the delay at the river had cost them a day they could not afford. So they saddled the horses and started north, Yates moving carefully, every stride of the mare sending a fresh jolt through his cracked ribs, and they talked while they rode. Side by side on the narrow trail, their horses close enough that their stirrups almost touched, and for the first time since Jackson, Yates could not deflect. "Eliza was my wife," he said. The words came out rough, like something that had been stored in a dry place too long and had lost its shape. "We married in Colorado, built a homestead near a creek, ran cattle, not many, maybe 40 head. She was 26, I was 29. He paused, swallowed, looked at the trail ahead instead of at Catherine, because looking at her while he said these things would break something inside him that he needed to keep whole. She was brave, stubborn. laughed at my bad jokes, which nobody else ever did. She could ride as good as me and shoot better, and she was not afraid of hard work or bad weather or anything the world threw at her. I thought we had made something that would last. His voice changed, dropped lower, went flat, the way a voice does when a man is trying to tell a story without feeling it. I took a contract to deliver cattle, buyer 3 days south. Good money. We needed it for winter supplies. I left on a Tuesday and I was supposed to be back by Friday. When I came over the ridge on Friday evening, I could see the smoke from 10 miles off. Catherine's horse moved closer, Daisy responding to some signal from her rider that Catherine did not know she was giving. The house was gone, Yates said. Burned to the foundation stones. The barn, too. Everything we built. The neighbors told me riders came. 4 men took what they wanted and burned the rest. Eliza was inside. The word inside hit the air and just stayed there, hovering between them like something physical. I was not there when she needed me, Yates said, and his voice sounded like it was being dragged over broken rock. I was 3 days south counting someone else's cattle, and she was dying alone. Catherine rode beside him in silence. The trail wound through pines, and the air smelled of cold sap and coming winter. And the only sounds were the horse's hooves and the creak of leather and the wind that never stopped blowing in mountain country. She did not say, "I am sorry." She did not say, "It was not your fault." She did not say any of the things that people say when someone tells them about grief, the well-meaning phrases that bounce off the surface of real pain without touching it. She said, "Thank you for telling me." That was all. And Yates felt something loosen in his chest, a knot that had been pulled tight for 3 years. And for one moment, the weight on his back was lighter than it had been since Colorado. But only for a moment, because telling part of the truth was like opening a door part way. The light that came through showed you how much darkness was still inside. And there was a part of the story Yates had not told, a part that lived in the deepest room of that locked space in his chest. And he was not ready to open that door. Not yet. Maybe not ever. What he did not tell Catherine was this. After the funeral, after the neighbors left and the ashes cooled, and there was nothing left but a stone marker and 60 acres of land that meant nothing without Eliza on it, Yates had gone hunting. He tracked the men who burned his home for 2 months across 3 territories. 3 of them died in a gunfight with federal marshals in Kansas before Yates caught up with them. But the 4th, the man who had ordered it all, a land speculator named Virgil Dawes, who wanted the water rights on Yates's Creek, that man Yates found in a saloon in Denver on a Thursday night in January. He did not use a gun. He used his hands. He beat Virgil Dawes until the man's face was something that no longer looked like a face, until the bartender and 2 other men pulled Yates off and held him against the wall while Dawes lay on the sawdust floor making sounds that were not quite human. And the thing that haunted Yates, the thing that drove him out of that saloon and out of Colorado and onto the road that had no end, was not what he had done. It was how much he wanted to finish it. Standing over that broken man with blood on his knuckles and rage in his throat, he had felt a hunger so deep and so dark that it terrified him more than the fire. He had seen the animal inside himself, and the animal was patient and strong, and it was always waiting. He walked out of that saloon, and he never stopped walking. 3 years. Wyoming, Idaho, Oregon, back to Wyoming. Working cattle drives and ranch jobs, never staying more than a season, never building anything that mattered. Because building meant losing, and losing meant the animal would come back, and this time maybe there would be no bartender to pull him off. And now there was something else, a rumor he had picked up 2 months ago in a bunkhouse south of Cheyenne. Virgil Dawes was alive. He had recovered from the beating, left Denver, and resurfaced in Montana Territory, near Bozeman. Speculating on land again, because men like Dawes never learned and never stopped. That was why Yates was heading north. Not just for Catherine. Not just because of Samuel's old debt of kindness. He was heading toward the man who had destroyed everything he loved. And he did not know whether he was going to find closure or revenge. And the not knowing was the real reason he had kept Catherine at arm's length. He was heading toward his own darkness, and he did not want her anywhere near it when he arrived. But he could not tell her any of that, not yet. So he told her about Eliza, and he swallowed the rest. And the wall that had come down an inch went back up a foot. Catherine felt it. She could feel him pulling away, even as they rode side by side, his body language closing like a book being shut, the brief openness of his confession sealing over with something harder and colder than before. And she understood, the way you understand weather not because anyone explains it, but because you learn to read the sky. He was afraid, not of the trail or the rider behind them, or the mountains ahead. He was afraid of what it meant to be known. And she had her own fear to contend with, because now that she knew the truth about Eliza, a new question had taken root in her mind and would not be pulled out. Am I a replacement? Does he help me because he sees her when he looks at me? Another woman alone, another chance to not fail. Am I Catherine to him? Or am I just the ghost of the woman he could not save wearing a different face? She could not ask that question. Not now. Maybe not ever. But it sat between them on the trail like a third rider, invisible and heavy. The afternoon wore on. Yates spotted fresh tracks again, closer than before. Single rider, heavy horse, gaining on them steadily. He told Catherine they were not stopping for the night. They would ride through. They rode side by side through the cold dark, closer than they had ever been, and further apart than ever. The moon rose over the mountains and painted the trail silver, and the silence between them was not the comfortable silence of two people who understand each other. It was the silence of two people standing on opposite sides of a wall, both wishing the wall was not there, and neither one willing to be the first to knock it down. Catherine thought, watching his profile in the moonlight, that Yates was not afraid of the wilderness out here. He was afraid of the wilderness inside himself, and she wondered if she had enough courage to love a man who was trying his hardest not to love her back. They arrived at the way station at mid-morning, and Catherine had never been so grateful to see smoke rising from a chimney. They had ridden through the night without stopping, and every muscle in her body felt like it had been taken apart and put back together wrong. Her eyes burned. Her hands were numb on the reins. She was fairly certain that if she dismounted, her legs would simply refuse to hold her. The way station was a rough building at a crossroads in the mountains, built of logs and stubbornness, with a corral full of horses and a hand-painted sign that read, Henderson Station, meals and lodging, no credit. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted through the morning air like a promise, and Daisy, who had better sense than most people, walked straight toward the corral without being asked. The woman who came out of the building was somewhere past 50, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a braid that could have moored a ship. She had arms like a woman who split her own firewood, and eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at Catherine's face, the dark circles and the cracked lips, and the exhaustion that went deeper than bone, and she put her hand on Catherine's arm and said, "Come inside," in a voice that allowed for no argument. Catherine did not argue. Inside, the station was warm, and smelled of wood smoke and baking bread. Mrs. Henderson, which was how she introduced herself, no first name offered and none required, sat Catherine at a table and put a plate of food in front of her. Bacon and eggs and biscuits with honey, and coffee so strong it could have stood up on its own. "Eat," Henderson said, "all of it." Catherine ate. She did not realize how hungry she was until the first bite, and then her body took over, and she cleaned the plate with a thoroughness that would have mortified Aunt Martha. Henderson watched with approval, the way a woman watches another woman taking care of herself, and when Catherine was done, Henderson poured more coffee and sat down across from her. Yates came in a moment later, moving carefully, his cracked ribs making every step deliberate. Henderson looked at him with an expression that had significantly less warmth than the one she had given Catherine. "You can sleep in the common room," Henderson said. "And if you have been running this girl through the mountains without proper rest, you and I are going to have words." "Yes, ma'am," Yates said, which was the most submissive thing Catherine had heard him say to anyone. Henderson showed Catherine to a small private room in the back. It had a real bed with clean sheets and a window that looked out at the mountains, and Catherine stood in the doorway and stared at it like she had forgotten what a bed looked like. Henderson stood behind her, arms folded. "How long since you slept?" Henderson asked. Catherine had to think about it. 2 days, she said. Maybe 3. "Lie down," Henderson said. "The world will still be falling apart when you wake up. It always is." But Catherine did not sleep. Not right away. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sounds of the way station, the clink of dishes, the creak of floorboards, Yates's low voice saying something she could not make out, and Henderson's sharp reply. And she thought about the last 3 days. The river crossing, the fever, the name Eliza spoken in the dark. The wall that went up even as Yates let her closer than anyone had been in 3 years. Henderson came back an hour later to check on her and found Catherine still sitting on the bed, staring at her hands. "You want to talk about it?" Henderson said. Catherine looked up. "There is a man following us. Robert Calloway sent someone to take my deed. And Yates, the man I am traveling with, he lost his wife 3 years ago. And I think he is helping me because he could not help her. And I do not know if what I am feeling is real or if I am just grateful and confusing that with something more." Henderson sat down on the bed beside her. She was quiet for a moment, which Catherine already knew was unusual for her. "That man of yours," Henderson said finally, "he looks at you like you are the last fire on a cold night. But he holds those reins like someone ready to bolt at the first loud noise." "He is not my man," Catherine said. "Not yet, maybe." Henderson raised one eyebrow, a gesture that communicated more than most people's entire vocabulary. "My husband was the same way. Tom Henderson. Cowboy. Stubborn as a mule and twice as hard-headed. He was afraid of everything that mattered and not afraid of anything that did not. I waited 3 years for him to figure out he wanted to stay. He was worth the wait. But I will tell you this. I did not wait quiet. I told him exactly what I wanted, and I let him decide if he was man enough to show up." She patted Catherine's hand and stood up. "Get some sleep. You look like something the cat would not bother dragging in." Catherine lay down. She closed her eyes. But sleep would not come because her mind had latched onto something that would not let go. Frank Harlan was behind them. Robert was hunting her deed. Every mile north put Yates in more danger, and the danger was because of her. Because she was here. Because she had asked him for help, and he had given it. And now he was riding through mountains with cracked ribs and a tracker on his trail. All because a woman from Boston could not solve her own problems. If I left now, she thought, alone, he would be safe. He could go to Bozeman, do whatever he needs to do. I am the burden. I am the reason there is danger. She sat up, found the scrap of paper and the pencil Henderson kept in the bedside drawer. She wrote quickly, "Gone north on my own. Thank you for everything. You owe me nothing." She signed it C.O. and folded it and left it on the pillow. She put on her coat and her hat and picked up her bags and walked as quietly as she could through the station and out the back door and across the yard to the stable. Daisy was in the last stall. The mare looked at Catherine with soft brown eyes and nickered quietly, the sound a horse makes when it recognizes someone it trusts. Catherine set down her bags and reached for the saddle hanging on the wall. Her hands stopped. She stood there in the cold stable, one hand on the leather, and something broke open inside her. If she ran, she was doing exactly what Yates did, exactly what she despised in him. Running because she was afraid. Not afraid of the mountains or the tracker or the cold. Afraid of being a burden. Afraid of needing someone. Afraid of being too much, taking up too much space, asking for too much. The way Aunt Martha had always made her feel. The way Robert had made her feel when he chose another woman. The way her father had made her feel, not on purpose, not with cruelty, but by leaving. By dying and leaving her alone and proving that the people you loved would always eventually go. Her father's voice rose up from memory. A thing he said to her once when she was 12 and wanted to quit her Latin studies because the other girls laughed at her. The bravest thing anyone can do, Catherine, is stay when everything in you says run. She tore up the note. She let the pieces fall like snow on the stable floor. She put the saddle back on the wall and picked up her bags and walked back inside and lay down on the bed. And finally, slept. She woke in the late afternoon to the sound of music. A harmonica, playing something slow and aching, a melody that felt like it was remembering something it could not quite reach. She went to the porch and found Yates sitting on the steps, playing. His eyes were closed. His hands were steady on the small silver instrument. The song was one she did not know, something that lived in the space between sad and beautiful, and the notes floated out over the mountain valley like a prayer spoken to no one and everyone at once. She sat down beside him. He stopped playing. Long silence. The sun was going down behind the peaks, turning the sky to gold and rose and the deep blue that comes just before dark. "You do not have to say anything," Catherine said. "I just want to sit here." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face shifted, not a smile but the shadow of one, the place where a smile lives when it is not ready to come out yet. He raised the harmonica to his lips and played again, and this time the melody changed. Still in a minor key, still carrying the weight of things lost, but there was something else woven through it now. Not happiness, not yet, but the possibility of it. A door cracked open in a dark room, and light coming through. They sat together on the porch until the stars came out, and Catherine leaned her shoulder against his, and he did not pull away. The next morning, a rider came in from the south. A man in his middle 40s with a weathered face and an army surplus coat, and the careful eyes of someone who was used to tracking things. He tied his horse at the rail and walked into the station and sat down at the common room table like he belonged there. Henderson served him breakfast. She poured his coffee and set out bacon and biscuits and did not smile, because Agnes Henderson did not waste smiles on men she had not yet decided to trust. "Looking for a couple headed north," the man said between bites. Tall fellow, dark-haired woman. Riding from the south. Might have come through here in the last day or two. Henderson dried a plate with a cloth and set it on the shelf. Her face gave away nothing. "Have not seen anyone matching that," she said. The man nodded. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper with an official-looking seal. "I am carrying legal documents," he said, "from a merchant in Jackson, regarding property that was stolen from him. Woman by the name of Owen. If she comes through, I would be obliged if you would let me know." Henderson said she would keep her eyes open. The man finished his breakfast, watered his horse, and rode north on the main trail. He did not look back. Catherine and Yates were in the private room and the stable, respectively. They had not heard the conversation. But Henderson had, and after Catherine and Yates packed their gear and brought their horses around, Henderson pulled Yates aside at the corral. Her hand closed on his arm with a grip that would have done credit to a blacksmith. "There is a man hunting your girl," she said. Her voice was low and hard. "He has got papers that look real enough to fool a sheriff. Take the West Fork through the pass. It is harder riding, but it keeps you off the main road. And Yates." She tightened her grip. "That man asked questions like someone who gets paid whether his quarry comes back breathing or not. You understand what I'm telling you?" Yates understood. He strapped their gear in double time. Catherine came out of the station and saw him moving with an urgency she had not seen before, his jaw tight, his hands quick and rough on the buckles. "What is wrong?" she said. He looked at her, and she saw it. Fear, real fear, in the eyes of a man she had thought was afraid of nothing. "Someone is coming for you," he said. "And I think I know who sent him." The West Fork was not a trail. It was an argument between the mountains and anyone foolish enough to try to cross them. Narrow ledges carved into rock faces that dropped away into nothing. loose scree that shifted and slid under the horses' hooves like the ground itself was trying to shake them off. And snow. Early season snow that started as sleet on the first day and turned heavy and thick on the second, blotting out the trail and the sky and everything except the 20 feet of white directly in front of them. Yates led them into it without hesitation. He knew mountain passes, knew the signs that said safe, and the signs that said turn back, and this pass was telling him both at the same time. But the main road meant Frank Harlan, and Frank Harlan meant losing the deed. And losing the deed meant Catherine had nothing. So they climbed. On the second day, the trail narrowed to a ledge barely wide enough for a single horse. Canyon on the left, dropping 500 feet to a river that looked like a silver thread from this height. Rock wall on the right, slick with ice and offering no handholds. Daisy was limping now. She had stepped on a sharp stone that morning, and the bruise on her front hoof was making her tentative and slow, placing each foot with the exaggerated care of an animal in pain. Catherine dismounted without being asked. She took Daisy's reins and walked, leading the mare along the ledge one careful step at a time. The wind pushed at her like hands trying to shove her into the emptiness. She did not look down. She kept her eyes on the trail directly in front of her and talked to Daisy in a low, steady voice. The same voice Yates used with the horses. The voice that said, "I am here, and we are going to be fine," even when fine was a lie. Yates rode ahead to scout, then came back and dismounted and walked beside Catherine. He put himself between her and the drop without saying anything about it. His cracked ribs were a constant fire in his side, and every step on the uneven ground sent fresh jolts of pain through his torso, but he did not mention it, and neither did she. They walked in silence, and the silence was not empty. It was full of all the things they were enduring together without complaint, and that shared suffering created something between them that was stronger than words. They made it through the ledge section by late afternoon, and found a sheltered spot below the tree line where the wind could not reach them. Yates built a fire, and they sat close to it, so close the heat stung their faces because the cold was not just uncomfortable now. It was dangerous. That night, they shared one blanket. There was no discussion about it. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and they had lost one of their bedrolls to the wind on the ledge. And the math was simple. One blanket, two people, shared warmth, or separate cold. Catherine lay down, and Yates lay beside her, close enough that she could feel his heartbeat through the layers of wool and cotton between them. Neither of them pretended the closeness was only practical. The third day was better. The trail widened. The snow eased. They descended into a valley where a mountain lake sat perfectly still in a bowl of granite, reflecting the peaks and the sky so clearly that it was hard to tell where the real mountains ended and the reflection began. They made camp beside the lake. Yates built the fire. Catherine cooked the last of their dried beef and made coffee, and they ate in a silence that was almost comfortable. Almost. After they ate, Yates taught Catherine to shoot. He had been thinking about it since Henderson's warning, since the word breathing had landed in his gut like a stone. Catherine needed to be able to defend herself, not because Yates planned to leave her, but because the world did not care about plans. He stood behind her, placed the spare revolver in her hands, and adjusted her grip. His arms along hers, his chest against her back, his breath warm on her neck, both of them pretending the physical closeness was purely instructional, both of them aware that it was not. Both of them choosing not to acknowledge the current running between them like lightning through a wire. "Squeeze the trigger," Yates said. "Do not pull. Squeeze, like you are pressing a key on a piano." "I have never played piano," Catherine said. "Then squeeze like you are testing a peach for ripeness." She laughed, short and surprised and genuine, the first laugh he had heard from her in days, and the sound of it cracked something open in his chest that he had spent 3 years nailing shut. She squeezed. The gun kicked. The bullet hit a pine tree 20 yards away, not where she was aiming, but close enough. Again, Yates said, and his voice was rough with something that had nothing to do with instruction. They practiced until the light faded. Catherine got better with each shot. She had steady hands and good eyes and the kind of focus that came from years of studying things carefully. And by the time the ammunition was running low, she could hit a target at 30 yards more often than she missed. The fire burned low. The lake reflected the first stars. And Yates, who had been fighting with himself for days, lost the fight. "I should not feel this way about you," he said. He was staring at the fire, not at her. His voice was tight like a rope under strain. "You deserve better than this. Better than a drifter who nearly killed a man with his bare hands." Catherine went very still. "What do you mean?" she said. And he told her, all of it. The part he had held back at the river. How he tracked Virgil Dawes to a saloon in Denver. How he beat the man until 3 strangers pulled him off. How he stood over the broken body with blood on his knuckles and felt not horror, but hunger. A wanting so deep and dark, it had no bottom. "I wanted to finish it," Yates said, "and the wanting was the worst part. Not what I did, what I wanted to do, what I would have done if that bartender had not been there." His hands were shaking. He clenched them into fists, then opened them, staring at his palms like they belonged to someone he did not recognize. "And there is something else," he said. He could not look at her. "I am heading to Bozeman because Virgil Dawes is in Montana again. I heard he's up near there, buying land, doing what he does. And I do not know if I am going to confront him or if I am going to walk away. I do not know what I'm going to do. But you should know that about me. Before you—" He stopped. "Before you what?" He could not finish the sentence because finishing it meant admitting something he had not yet admitted to himself. Catherine was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Yates thought she might get up and walk away, and he would not blame her. Long enough that the fire burned down another inch, and the stars multiplied overhead and the cold crept closer. Then she spoke, and her voice was shaking with something that was not fear. "You are using that story as a shield," she said. "You are afraid to love me, so you are giving me a reason to be afraid of you first." Yates stared at her. No one had ever said it that plainly. No one had ever looked straight into the darkest room of his soul and described what they saw with such unflinching accuracy. "You want to know what I think?" Catherine continued. She was angry now, and the anger was beautiful and terrifying and true. "I think you stopped. That is what matters. You had every reason to kill that man, and you stopped. That does not make you a monster, Yates. It makes you a man who chose not to be one." She kissed him, not gently, not tentatively. She took his face in her hands and kissed him with a fierceness that left no room for argument or retreat. A kiss that said, "I see you, all of you, the gentle hands and the dark hunger and the grief and the guilt and the man underneath all of it who is worth more than he knows. I see you, and I am not running." She pulled back. Her eyes were bright and her cheeks were flushed and her hands were still on his face. "That is so you know I am not afraid of you," she said. "But I will not wait for a man who is determined to run away." She let go of him, turned her back, lay down in her bedroll with her face to the dark, and she did not say another word. Yates sat by the fire all night. He watched the flames die to embers and the embers glow and fade and the darkness fill in the spaces where light had been. He looked at Catherine's back, the rise and fall of her breathing, the dark hair spilling across the bedroll, and he knew she was right. About the shield, about the fear, about everything. He woke her before dawn. The snow had stopped, the sky was clear, fading from black to gray, and the stars were going out one by one like candles in a church after the service ends. "I am not running," he said. She looked at him in the half-light, searching his face for the lie she had learned to expect from men. She did not find one. "I do not know how to stay yet," he said, "but I am learning." Catherine looked at him for a long time, and then she nodded, and something in her eyes shifted from doubt to something that was not quite trust and not quite hope, but lived in the country between the two. She believed him. They rode into Virginia City on a cold, bright afternoon with the sun low in the west and the mountains casting long shadows across the valley. The town hit Catherine like a wall of noise after days of silence. Freight wagons crowded the streets. Men on horseback shouted to each other over the clatter of hammers and the whine of saws. New buildings were going up on every corner, raw lumber gleaming yellow against the older structures. It was chaos and energy, and the smell of sawdust and manure and possibility. And Catherine sat in her saddle and stared at it like a woman who had been underwater for a very long time and had just broken the surface. "This is it," she said. "Not quite," Yates said. "Your land is 15 miles south, but we start here." The land office was a small building near the center of town, wedged between a dry goods store and a saloon, in a way that seemed to summarize the priorities of the territory. Catherine dismounted carefully, her body still stiff from the mountain pass, and walked through the door with her satchel clutched against her chest. The clerk was a young man named Willard, with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that sat crookedly on his nose. He took Catherine's deed and her father's papers and spread them on the desk and studied them with the careful attention of someone whose job consisted entirely of reading small print. He cross-referenced the deed with a large leather-bound ledger. He looked at a map on the wall. He made notes on a piece of paper. Then he frowned. "Ma'am," he said, "I need to inform you of something. A Mr. Robert Calloway of Jackson, Wyoming, filed a claim dispute with this office approximately 2 weeks ago. He alleges that this deed was fraudulently obtained by your father, and that you removed it from his possession without his authorization." The room tilted. Catherine gripped the edge of the desk and held on. "That is a lie," she said. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that. "Robert Calloway is a con man. He lured me west with a promise of marriage to get access to this deed. When I discovered he had married another woman, I left Jackson with my property. My property. This deed belongs to me." Willard looked uncomfortable. He adjusted his spectacles. "I understand, ma'am, and I am not making a judgment, but the law requires me to note the dispute. Without corroboration, a witness who can attest to the card game where your father obtained this deed, or a signed transfer document from the losing party. I am required to hold the claim in abeyance until the matter is resolved. That could take months." Months. The word dropped into Catherine's stomach like a stone into a well. Months of waiting, months with no land, no home, no income, months of living on nothing while Robert Calloway's lies worked their way through a system that did not know her and had no reason to believe her over a well-dressed merchant with official-looking paperwork. "My father is dead," Catherine said. "The man he won it from could be anywhere. How am I supposed to find a witness to a card game that happened 3 years ago?" Willard spread his hands. "I'm sorry, ma'am, if there were another way." Yates, who had been standing behind Catherine listening without interrupting, stepped forward. His voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of authority that comes not from volume but from certainty. "What exactly does Calloway's claim say?" he asked. Willard looked at the paperwork. "He says the deed was originally the property of a business associate. He says your father obtained it through fraud. He says Miss Owen removed it from Calloway's possession when she left Jackson." Yates nodded slowly. "So he is claiming the deed was his, not the original owner's. His. That is correct. Even though Catherine's father won it in a card game 3 years before Calloway ever wrote his first letter to her. So Calloway is claiming ownership of a deed he never held, from a game he was not part of, involving a man he never met." Willard blinked. "That is one way to characterize it, yes. That is the only way to characterize it," Yates said. "Because it is the truth." He turned to Catherine. "We will figure this out." It was the first time he had said we. Not, "I will help you figure this out." Not, "You will figure this out." We. The word settled into the air between them like a hand finding another hand in the dark. They checked into a boarding house near the center of town. 2 rooms, because propriety still mattered even in a territory where most of the rules were written in pencil. Catherine sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall and tried to feel something other than the numb exhaustion that had settled over her like a second skin. That evening, Yates went to the saloons. He was looking for information, and saloons in mining towns were where information lived. He sat at a bar and ordered whiskey and listened to the conversations around him the way a man listens to weather, sorting the important from the noise. He learned about Robert Calloway. The bartender, a heavy-set man with a red beard and the tired eyes of someone who has heard everything, knew the name. Calloway, the bartender said. Yeah, he has a system. Writes to women back east. Lonely ones, desperate ones, ones with property or money, charms them by mail, gets them to come west, takes what they have got. And if they fight back, he buries them in legal paper until they give up or break. The bartender leaned forward. There was a widow, he said, Clara Sutton, 2 years back. Calloway got her homestead through the same kind of forged claim. She lost everything, hanged herself in her barn on Christmas Eve. Yates's hands tightened on his glass until the knuckles went white. And nobody stopped him, Yates said. The bartender shrugged. He is careful, keeps his hands clean, uses hired men for the dirty work. And he has got friends in the right places. Nobody wants to go up against a man with money and connections, not out here where the law is thin and the distances are long. Yates finished his whiskey and left. On his way out, he asked one more question. Not about Calloway. Virgil Dawes, he said, land speculator, heard he was in this area. The bartender thought about it. Dawes. Yeah, he was here. 2-3 months ago. Bought some claims south of town. But he moved on. Heard he went to Colorado. Or maybe Oregon. Nobody seemed too sorry to see him go. Yates stood in the street outside the saloon. The night air was cold and sharp, and the stars were thick overhead. And he felt like a man standing at a crossroads where all the signs had been torn down. Virgil Dawes was gone. The man Yates had been hunting, the ghost that had given his wandering a purpose for 3 years, had slipped away again. There was nothing pulling Yates to Bozeman now, no debt to settle, no darkness to walk toward. There was only Catherine. And that realization, standing alone in a cold street in Virginia City, Montana territory, terrified Yates Young more than Virgil Dawes ever had. Because Dawes was a simple equation. Violence begat violence. But Catherine was not simple at all. Catherine was the most complicated and beautiful and infuriating equation Yates had ever encountered. And the answer to her was not revenge or justice or any of the things he knew how to solve with his hands. The answer to her was something he had not practiced in 3 years. The answer was staying. He walked back to the boarding house. Catherine was in her room. She had lit a lamp and was sitting at the small desk, and when she opened the door at his knock, he could see she had been crying. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind, where the tears run down your face while you sit perfectly still and pretend they are not there. Calloway has done this before, Yates said. At least 3 women, maybe more. One of them is dead because of him. Catherine's expression did not change. Of course he has, she said. Men like Robert do not stop at one. Yates took a breath. The words that came next were not planned. They came from the place where fear and love lived side by side, indistinguishable in the dark. Marry me, he said. If you are my wife, I can file on the land with you, defend the claim legally. I can protect you. Catherine looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were red from the tears she had not admitted to, and her face was tired, and the lamplight turned her dark hair to something that looked like it belonged in a painting rather than a boarding house in Montana. No, she said. Yates felt the word like a physical blow. Catherine's voice was steady. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steel. I will not marry a man for a piece of paper, she said. I did that once already. I agreed to marry a stranger because it was the practical choice, because Aunt Martha said it would solve everything, because I was afraid and desperate and I let fear decide for me. If you want to marry me, Yates Young, you ask me for the right reason, not because you need to protect me, because you want to be with me. She closed the door. Yates stood in the hallway and stared at the grain of the wood, and understood that Catherine Owen had just taught him something that 3 years of wandering never could. That protecting someone and deciding for them are not the same thing. That love offered as rescue is not love at all. that the bravest thing he could do was not save her, but stand beside her and let her save herself. He went to the window at the end of the hallway and looked out at the street. And the lesson, hard as it was, did not help much when he saw Frank Harlan tying his horse to the post across the road. Morning came cold and gray. Yates was awake before the sun, sitting in the common room of the boarding house, drinking coffee he could not taste, watching the front door. He had not slept. He had spent the night at that hallway window, watching Frank Harlan's horse stand patient and still at the hitching post, and thinking about what was coming and how he was going to face it without becoming the thing he feared most. Harlan walked in at 8:30. He moved the way a man moves when he has done a thing so many times it has become routine. He removed his hat. He nodded to the boarding house owner, a stout woman named Mrs. Pringle, who was wiping down the breakfast table. He was polite, professional. His army surplus coat was buttoned to the neck and his boots were clean despite the mountain miles, and when he looked at Yates sitting by the fire, his eyes held no malice. Just business. "I'm looking for a woman named Catherine Owen," Harlan said to Mrs. Pringle. "I have documents authorizing me to retrieve property she is holding that belongs to a Mr. Robert Calloway of Jackson, Wyoming." He produced the papers. They looked official. They had a seal that looked real enough to fool anyone who was not looking close. Mrs. Pringle glanced at Yates. Yates shook his head, the smallest motion, and Pringle, who had survived 20 years running a boarding house in a mining town by knowing when to keep quiet, said she would check the register. Yates stood up. The two men looked at each other across the common room. Harlan was shorter than Yates, but built thick through the chest and arms. The body of a man who had spent years carrying heavy things over long distances. His hand rested near his holster the way some men rest their hand on a fence post, not as a threat, but because that was where it naturally fell. "I have no quarrel with you, mister," Harlan said. His voice was even, almost pleasant. "I am here for the woman and the deed. You can step aside and nobody gets hurt." The rage was there. Yates could feel it, rising from the same dark place where it had lived for 3 years, the animal hunger that had almost killed a man in Denver and had been waiting patiently ever since. His fists clenched, his vision narrowed. He saw Harlan not as a man doing a job, but as a member of a species, the species of men who used violence for profit. The species that had burned his home and killed his wife and walked away counting their money. But Catherine was upstairs. If Yates attacked and lost, she was alone. If he attacked and won, if the animal got loose and he could not pull it back, he became the very thing he was running from. Either way, Catherine lost. So Yates made a choice, the hardest choice of his life. He did not attack. He talked. "Those documents will need to be verified by the county sheriff," Yates said. His voice was calm, which cost him everything. "Nobody is handing over anything without lawful authority." Harlan's expression did not change. "I have lawful authority right here," he said, tapping the papers. "You have paper," Yates said. "That is not the same thing, and you know it." A muscle twitched in Harlan's jaw. He was not used to being stalled. He was used to intimidation working quickly and cleanly, which was what made him good at his job. He calculated the odds. A fight in a boarding house in broad daylight, in a town with the sheriff's office 3 blocks away. Bad for business. "I can wait," Harlan said. He sat down at the table, folded his arms. "But I will not wait long." Upstairs, Catherine had heard everything. She was not crouching behind her door in fear. She was not hoping for rescue. She was putting on her boots. The night before, after she closed the door on Yates, Catherine had stood at her window and looked at the street and seen Frank Harlan's horse at the hitching post. She recognized the Army surplus saddle, the heavy build of the animal, the same horse that had been tracking them for nearly 3 weeks across 2 territories. She did not sleep that night either. Instead, she prepared. She gathered every letter Robert Calloway had ever written her, the ones full of promises and plans for their life together, the ones that mentioned her father's land, the ones that proved he knew about the deed long before she arrived in Jackson and had lured her west specifically to get it. She wrote out a statement, clear and detailed, describing everything that had happened since she arrived in Jackson. She included dates and names and the specific words Robert had used when he asked about the deed. She folded the statement and put it on her bed, visible, in case anything happened to her and someone needed to know the truth. She also told Mrs. Pringle at dawn to send for the sheriff in 15 minutes regardless of what happened. Pringle, who had lost a niece to a man not unlike Robert Calloway, said she would do it, and meant every word. So when Catherine heard Frank Harlan's voice in the common room, she did not wait. She climbed out the back window of her room, dropped into the alley behind the boarding house, and ran 3 blocks to the county sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Briggs was a man in his 50s who had seen enough of the territory's ugliness to be cynical about human nature, but not enough to have lost his sense of justice entirely. He had a handlebar mustache and tired eyes and a reputation for being slow to anger and thorough in his work. Catherine walked into his office breathing hard, set her letters and her statement and her deed on his desk, and told him everything. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She spoke clearly and steadily, and she laid out the facts the way her father had taught her to construct an argument, point by point, evidence by evidence, until the shape of the truth was undeniable. "There is a man at Mrs. Pringle's boarding house right now," Catherine finished. "He is carrying forged documents. He was sent by Robert Calloway to take my deed by force or by fraud. My father won that land in an honest card game, and I have carried it across 300 miles of mountain country. And I am not going to lose it to a man who makes his living stealing from women." Briggs studied the letters. He studied the deed. He looked at Catherine's face, and whatever he saw there was enough. He stood up and reached for his hat. He sent his deputy to collect a second man, and the 3 of them walked to the boarding house with Catherine at their side. When Sheriff Briggs walked through the front door, Frank Harlan was still sitting at the table, and Yates was still standing between him and the stairs. Neither man had moved. The air between them was thick enough to cut. "Frank Harlan," Briggs said. "I am Tom Briggs, county sheriff. I need to see those documents you are carrying." Harlan looked at the sheriff. He looked at the 2 deputies. He looked at Catherine standing behind them, and something shifted in his face, the small adjustment of a man who realizes the job has gone sideways. He produced the papers. Briggs studied them. His mustache twitched. "These are forged," he said. "Seal is wrong. I have seen enough territorial documents to know what the real ones look like, and these are not it." He looked up at Harlan. "You are under arrest for intimidation, carrying fraudulent legal instruments, and whatever else I think of between here and the jail." The deputies moved forward. Harlan did not resist. He was a professional, and professionals knew when the game was over. They put him in irons and walked him out, and the boarding house fell quiet for the first time since dawn. But there was more. Sheriff Briggs turned to Catherine and Yates and said something that changed everything. "I should tell you," he said, "that I received a letter 3 days ago. Express rider came all the way from a way station down in the mountains. Woman named Henderson." Catherine's breath caught. Henderson wrote that a man fitting Harlan's description passed through her station, asking after a couple heading north. Briggs continued. "She said he was carrying false papers and had stated his intent to retrieve property by any means. She also included statements from travelers who had passed through, accounts of at least 2 other women Robert Calloway had swindled using the same method. One of them confirmed the story of Clara Sutton." Briggs folded the letter and put it in his vest pocket. "Between Henderson's letter and the letters you have provided, Miss Owen, and the forged documents Harlan was carrying, I have more than enough to send a formal complaint to the territorial marshal in Helena for Robert Calloway's arrest. Your deed will be registered in full. The claim dispute is dismissed." Catherine stood very still. The room blurred and refocused and blurred again, and she realized she was crying, which she had promised herself she would not do, and she did not care. "Thank you," she said to the sheriff. And then, because it needed to be said, "Mrs. Henderson saved my life. I want you to know that. She had no reason to help me beyond kindness, and she may have saved my life." Briggs nodded. "I will make sure she knows," he said, and left. The boarding house was quiet. Mrs. Pringle retreated to the kitchen. Catherine stood in the common room, the tears still wet on her face, and looked at Yates. He was sitting on the back steps. She found him there, staring at his hands the way he had stared at them after Denver. His fingers were trembling, not from cold. She sat beside him. She took his hands in hers. They were large and rough and scarred and shaking, and she held them the way you hold something fragile and strong at the same time. "You did not lose control," she said. "You were there. You stayed." Yates looked at her. His green eyes were bright with something that was not tears, because Yates Young did not cry, except that he did, right then, one tear tracking down his weathered cheek and disappearing into the collar of his shirt. "Dawes is gone," Catherine said. "You told me." He moved on. "Yeah," Yates said, "he is gone. Are you going to follow him?" The question hung in the cold air, and Yates looked at this woman. This woman who climbed out windows and ran through alleys, who wrote contingency plans on scraps of paper, who faced down her own fear in a stable at midnight and chose to stay, who kissed him with a fury that burned through every wall he had ever built and said, "I see you and I am not running." "No," he said, "I am done following ghosts." The silence that followed was the first real silence between them. Not uncomfortable, not heavy, just two people sitting together in the clear space that exists after a storm has passed and the air smells like rain and possibility. That night, Yates knelt in front of Catherine in the small boarding house room. He had no ring. Eliza's ring was in his saddlebag, and it belonged to the past. He had nothing. Nothing but shaking hands, and a heart cracked open so wide he could feel the cold air moving through it. "I am not asking because of the land," he said. "I am not asking because I need to protect you, or because it is practical, or because it is the smart thing to do. I am asking because without you I do not want the land or the house or any of it. I am asking because you are the bravest person I have ever known, and you made me want to stay somewhere for the first time in 3 years. And if you will have me, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worth it." He stopped, took a breath. "Will you build a life with me, Catherine?" Catherine looked at the man kneeling before her. His green eyes were open and raw and terrified and sure all at the same time, and his hands were shaking, and he had nothing to offer except himself, and that was everything. "Yes," she said. Then she said it again, because once was not enough for a word that heavy. "Yes. But we wait 1 week. I want to marry you when everything is settled. Not in the middle of a storm." Yates nodded. "A week," he said. "I can wait a week. I have waited 3 years. A week is nothing." And he smiled. Not the shadow of a smile or the place where a smile might live. A real smile, full and warm, and so unexpected on his weathered face that Catherine felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. They spent that week in Virginia City, and it was the strangest and best week of Catherine's life. She registered the deed at the land office in her own name, Catherine Owen, not Catherine Young, not yet. That mattered to her in a way she could not entirely explain, except that she had come 300 miles to own something that was hers, and she was going to hold it in her own 2 hands before she shared it with anyone. Yates filed a claim on the adjacent quarter section, 160 acres that shared a border with Catherine's 60. He paid the filing fee with money he had saved from 5 years of cattle work and ranch jobs, and when the clerk asked him the purpose of the claim, Yates said, "I am building a home." A letter arrived from Henderson, short and to the point, like the woman herself. "Heard you made it. Coming to the wedding. Do not try to stop me." She arrived 2 days later, having ridden for 2 days straight through mountain country that would have discouraged a woman half her age. She walked into the boarding house, looked at Catherine, looked at Yates, and said, "Well, about time." The wedding was on a Saturday morning, in the small Methodist church at the end of Virginia City's main street. The minister was a thin man with kind eyes. The witnesses were Henderson, Sheriff Briggs, the clerk Willard, and Mrs. Pringle, who brought a cake she had baked at 4 in the morning and refused to take payment for. Catherine wore a blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, purchased with money she had earned that week helping the town doctor organize his medical library. She had wanted to pay for it herself, and she did. Yates wore a clean shirt and brushed the dust off his hat and looked like a man who was about to jump off a cliff and was glad about it. When the minister asked him to speak his vows, Yates took Catherine's hands and looked into her eyes, and said words he had been composing in his head for days, words that did not sound like any wedding vow she had ever heard. "I do not promise to never be afraid," he said. "I promise to stay anyway. Every day, I promise to choose staying." Catherine's throat closed. She blinked hard and felt the tears come and did not fight them. When it was her turn, she held his hands tight and said the vow she had written on the back of a feed receipt the night before. "I do not promise to never doubt myself," she said. "I promise to let you love me when I do." Henderson cried. She denied it later and would deny it for the rest of her life, but every person in that church saw it. The minister pronounced them married. Yates kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak, and Mrs. Pringle clapped, and Sheriff Briggs shook Yates's hand, and Willard congratulated them with a formality that made everyone smile. That afternoon, while Catherine was packing their things for the ride south to their land, Yates took something from his saddlebag, the leather pouch, the gold ring. He held it in his palm for a long time, feeling the weight of it, the 3 years of grief and guilt and wandering it represented. He walked to the creek at the edge of town where cottonwood trees grew tall and gold in the autumn light. He chose a tree, an old one with roots that went deep, and he knelt and dug a small hole at its base with his hands. He placed the ring in the earth. He covered it gently. "Goodbye, Eliza," he said. He did not say more. He did not need to. The wind moved through the cottonwoods and made a sound like breathing, like the world itself was exhaling, and Yates stood up and brushed the dirt from his knees and walked back to his wife. Catherine did not ask where he had been. She did not need to. She trusted him to carry his past without it threatening their future. They rode south to their valley on a morning bright with October sun. The land was everything the map had promised, and more. A creek running clear and cold through meadows turning gold, cottonwoods and aspens standing like sentries along the water, forested hills on 3 sides, mountains beyond, and a sky so wide and blue it made Catherine's chest ache with something she eventually identified as belonging. "This is it," she said. "This is home. They built the cabin together." Yates cut the logs and Catherine stripped them. He taught her to notch, and she taught him patience. They argued about the placement of the door and the size of the windows and whether the stove should go on the east wall or the west. And the arguments were the kind that end in laughter and compromise, and the slow discovery that building something with another person is the most intimate thing 2 people can do. The first winter came hard. Snow deeper than Catherine had imagined possible. Cold that crept through the log walls and settled into bone. Their supplies ran low, and there were days when the wind howled so loud they could not hear each other speak, and nights when the darkness felt like a living thing pressing against the cabin from all sides. In February, the darkness pressed inside. Yates had been working himself past exhaustion, up before dawn, cutting firewood, hauling water, checking the 3 cows they had bought in town, repairing the fence, reinforcing the barn roof, working and working and working until he could barely stand. Catherine watched him grow thinner and quieter, watched the shadows deepen under his eyes, watched his hands develop a tremor that came from muscle fatigue and would not stop. She knew what was happening. He was punishing himself, trying to prove that he would never again fail to protect his family, trying to outwork the guilt that whispered Eliza's name in the dark hours, trying to be everywhere at once, as if sheer effort could keep the world from taking something else away from him. She confronted him on a night when the wind was screaming outside, and the fire was the only warm thing in the world. "Yates," she said, "you have to stop." "I am fine," he said. He was splitting kindling by the fire, his movements mechanical, his eyes glassy with exhaustion. "You are not fine. You have not slept more than 3 hours a night in 2 weeks. You are not eating. Your hands are shaking. Look at your hands, Yates." He looked. They were shaking. He clenched them into fists. "If I stop," he said, and his voice cracked like ice on a spring pond. "If I rest, something will go wrong. It always goes wrong when I am not paying attention." Catherine crossed the small room. She stood in front of him. She was not gentle. This was not a moment for gentleness. "You are not going to work yourself to death to make up for something that was never your fault," she said. "I did not marry a ghost, Yates. I married you. And I need you alive. Not perfect. Alive." Silence. The fire crackled. The wind screamed. Catherine put her hand flat on his chest. She could feel his heart beating under her palm, fast and hard and stubborn, the heart of a man who would not stop until the world forced him to. "Your heart is still beating," she said. "You are still here." He broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, the way men in stories break. Quietly, the way real people break. With a shudder and a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a breath, and a letting go that you could see move through his body like a wave. She held him. He held her. They stood in the small cabin they had built together while the wind tried to tear the world apart outside, and they held on. In the morning, he did not rise before dawn. He stayed. Catherine told him she was carrying their child on a cold morning in March, when the snow was beginning to soften and the first brave birds were testing the air. "Are you sure?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I am sure." Yates stared at her. Then he made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, a sound she had never heard from him before. He picked her up off the ground, which lasted approximately 2 seconds, before his ribs reminded him they were still not fully healed, and he put her down and they both laughed until they cried. "A baby," he said. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Catherine asked. "I know we wanted to be more settled first." "Happy," Yates said. He took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and her cheeks and her mouth and her forehead again. "I am happier than I have been in my whole life. This is everything, Catherine. You are everything." Rose was born in September of 1879 in the cabin they had built with their own hands, with the help of a midwife from Virginia City and a neighbor woman who rode 5 miles through a rainstorm to be there. The labor was long, and there were hours when Catherine thought her body might not survive what it was being asked to do, and Yates sat beside her and held her hand and did not leave. When the baby came, squalling and red and perfect, Yates cut the cord with hands that were steady for the first time in days. He cleaned his daughter and wrapped her in the blanket Henderson had sent, and he held her against his chest and looked down at her face and wept. Openly, honestly, the tears of a man who has been given something he thought the world had permanently taken away. "She has got green eyes," he whispered. Catherine, exhausted and triumphant, smiled. "Like her father," she said. That night, Yates played his harmonica for Rose. A lullaby his mother had taught him, the same melody he had played on Henderson's porch, the same tune that had lived in that silver instrument waiting for a reason to come out. But it was different now. The minor key had shifted. The ache was still there because ache is part of any song worth singing. But woven through it was something new. Joy. Gratitude. The sound of a man who has finally come home. The songs were not sad anymore. 10 years later, on an autumn afternoon in 1889, Catherine stood at the edge of Virginia City. But she was not standing at the edge with everything she owned in 2 bags and nothing but hope. She was standing in front of a building, a schoolhouse, her schoolhouse. A sign above the door read, "Young School, established 1885. Her name, her work, her gift to the valley that had given her everything." In her arms was Sarah, their youngest, 2 years old, and already possessed of an opinion about everything. Rose, 10 years old, green-eyed and stubborn as both her parents combined, was helping James, 8 years old and quiet and bookish like the grandfather he would never meet, tie his horse at the rail. Inside the schoolhouse, a small girl sat at a desk practicing her letters. Her name was Lily. Her mother was Margaret Avery, who had been Margaret Calloway, who had finally left Robert 2 years after Catherine's story began, and brought her daughter to Montana, to the valley. to the school that Catherine had built. Catherine watched little Lily form the letter C with careful crooked strokes, and she thought about the circles that life draws. The woman Robert married instead of Catherine now sent her daughter to Catherine's school. There was no bitterness in that, only grace, only the quiet understanding that the worst thing that ever happened to Catherine, that day at Robert's door when Margaret answered with a ring on her finger, was also the beginning of everything good. She had received a letter that morning from the Territorial Marshal's office in Helena. Robert Calloway had been arrested in Colorado Territory for fraud and was awaiting trial. If convicted, he would be sentenced to the Territorial Prison at Deer Lodge. Catherine read the letter and folded it and put it in her pocket. She did not feel triumph. She felt tired. And then she felt finished with him. A chapter closed, a door locked for the last time. She looked up. A rider was approaching from the south. He sat tall in the saddle the way he always had, but his sandy brown hair had gone silver at the temples, and there were lines around his green eyes that had not been there 10 years ago. He wore the same dusty brown hat, the same leather vest, and he rode with the same easy confidence that had drawn her eye on a desperate afternoon in Jackson, Wyoming, when she had nothing but a knife and a deed, and the stubborn refusal to give up. Yates reined in his horse. He looked at his wife standing in front of the school she had built, surrounded by the children they had made in the valley, where they had chosen to stay. He looked at all of it, the schoolhouse and the children and the mountains and the woman, and he smiled the way he only smiled for her, full and warm and a little bit wondering, like a man who still cannot quite believe his luck. "Where are you headed, miss?" he said. Catherine laughed. The same laugh that made him fall in love with her on a mountain trail a lifetime ago. The same laugh he heard every morning and never got tired of hearing. "Home," she said. He dismounted. He kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that comes from 10 years of practice and still manages to surprise. Rose groaned. "Do you two have to do that every single time?" James laughed. Sarah clapped her sticky hands and said again, again. They walked toward the schoolhouse together, Yates's arm around Catherine's waist, their children running ahead and circling back and running ahead again the way children do. And Catherine thought about the girl she had been. 24 years old, standing at the edge of a town with everything she owned in 2 bags and nothing but hope. A green-eyed cowboy had asked her where she was going, and she had answered north because she did not know the true answer yet. Now she knew. She had always been headed toward him.